Hey everyone, it's Duncan from Overland Journals. Have you ever wondered, you're about to get your second battery, the auxiliary battery, that's your AGM or could be lithium ion, whatever, and you want to figure out what capacity of a battery you should be buying? Well, today's video, I'm going to share with you the processes I went through. Welcome back. If this is your first time on my channel, please hit the subscription button and the notification bell because my channel is all about sharing my experiences in overlanding with the rest of the community, and I bring out a video every single week. At the end of this video, if you found it useful, please give it a thumbs up. Please share it. That helps me grow my channel. If you got questions or comments, leave them below. Okay, so to today's video. Now, this is a process I went through and I shared it with you, so hopefully it'll be useful to you. Now, when I was trying to get my second battery, that's the auxiliary battery, something that always was in the back of my mind was what capacity of a battery do I buy? Because there's always, 100 amp hours, 200 amp hours, 150 amp hours, and so on. And obviously, the higher that number goes, the price goes up considerably. Now, before I get into explaining what amp hours are, I need to mention that I am not a auto sparky in any sense. Now, those of you who are overseas, auto sparky is Australian for an auto electrician. So what I'm sharing with you is what I've picked up from friends and the garages I go to and where they do have auto sparkies. So the whole idea is of a second battery or an auxiliary battery, whether it be an AGM or a lithium ion, if you're going for the new technology, is to try and get a battery that'll keep your accessories running, particularly when your engine's switched off. Perhaps you've come to the end of the day, you've set up camp, but you still need to get some of your accessories like your fridge or fridges, your camp lights, the working floodlights, and whatever other accessories you've got to keep them running up until the next morning. Either you start your engine and get going, so your alternator will kick back in and give the necessary power that's needed to keep that battery topped up again. Or perhaps you've got solar, many of us do now, and then you chuck the solar panel or solar blanket out there and then the sun will help that battery cope. But it's that time in between. This is particularly in the evening. So how do you figure it out? Now, let's first get down to some technicalities here. Now, when you buy a battery, it's always the voltage that many of us talk of. 12 volt. That's what one of our vehicles would take, 12 volts. But the voltage doesn't give you the information that's critical, that's useful. What you need to know is amp hours. Now, what is an amp hour and what is an amp? So amp is the current, that's 12 volt or the voltage, and you got the amps. It's the amperage. That's when you're thinking of a load, that is how much consumption is going to be done by your accessories. It's always worked out in amperage. Now, how they work out the amp hours is basically manufacturers will give you a rating for their battery in terms of amp hours, and that is if the draw is 1 amp hour or 1 amp per hour, so 1 amp hour, how much of amps that battery can supply. So if you got a battery and it says it's rated to be, let's say, 100 amp hours or 115 amp hours, what the manufacturer is telling you is that that battery at a consumption of 1 amp per hour, it can supply up to that many hours, 110 or 100 amp hours or 100 hours. Now that figure sounds fantastic, but there are certain other things you need to keep in mind. So particularly if you've got an AGM battery, in AGM batteries, and I've talked about this in a previous video as well, and I'll leave a link to that in the description below. Once an AGM battery hits 50% capacity, thereafter, it's pretty useless. You're running the battery down. It's what I would like to call diminishing returns thereafter. So if you buy a battery that's rated as 100 amp hour, just keep in mind that you're roughly getting about 50 amp hours. Okay, that's very important. Now, of course, if you go for the newer technology, lithium ions, where you can drain it all the way down to 100%, then that calculation doesn't really matter. Whatever the manufacturer tells you, that's what you get. Now, okay, so the thing is, your accessories are not going to consume 1 amp per hour. It's a lot more depending on what kind of accessories you've got. So in my case, when my fridge is running and I've got 3 work lights or floodlights outside where when I'm setting up camp, I switch those on. I don't obviously switch on all 3 at the same time, but supposing I did, and the fridge is running. Now, fridges, you need to be very careful, because when you switch on a fridge for the very first time after it's been shut for a while, obviously that compressor needs to run until the internal setting is reach the cool setting that you have set to. So whatever that may be, 0 degrees, 5 degrees or whatever, it could work hard to get there. But ideal way to measure it is how, once it's at optimum and the compressor is more at a maintenance mode, that's when you should get the reading. Now, how do you get the reading? I'll come to that in a minute, so hang in there with me. So fridges, or fridge, in my case I've got 2 fridges, but I only run 1 at night when I park off, because my center console fridge, which sits in the front between the 2 front seats, that I run only as long as the engine is running, even though it's plugged into the accessories which are consuming from the auxiliary battery. I switch it off because that's where I keep mostly my drinks, and once I switch off, it keeps its coolness for a while. Whereas the fridge at the back, which is my 40-liter, that's where all the cooking stuff and so we'll probably be accessing it now and then. Now, my fridge, once it reaches optimum, and I usually run it around -5, no more than that. I did a video some time back on how I keep my fridges running efficiently. I'll leave a link to those videos below as well. Go check it out. And so effectively, the compressor runs for a short period of time every hour, if that makes sense. So what it's basically doing is just maintaining the coolness inside the fridge, so it doesn't have to run continuously. So in my case, when I measured with the lights on, the back fridge, the 40-liter fridge running, and perhaps charging camera batteries and so on through my inverter, my total consumption is approximately 6 to 7 amps per hour. Okay, so let's assume on the higher side in my case, which is, it varies from individual to individual depending on your setup and what accessories you're running off the battery or your auxiliary battery. In my case, I try and keep it as low as possible. So a lot of the time it's the fridge that will be continuously running through the night, whereas lights, I don't really tend to use a lot of those lights. I got lanterns which I carry around, and I've got some solar powered lights as well. So when I set up camp, that's what I get going. Also, another thing I do, and I've mentioned this in some previous videos, for those of you who have been watching regularly, you'll know, as a practice, Johnny and I, we don't like driving in the dark, so we try and park off or find a campsite 2 hours before sunset and then set up camp. So that way we don't really need lighting to set up camp. By the time it gets dark, we're pretty well set up. We've got a fire going, we got our outside lanterns set up, so those lights which are hooked onto the auxiliary battery don't really get used as much. Also, as far as batteries charging or laptops running, downloading my footage and things like that onto my laptop, I try and also do that during the day, when perhaps when we'll stop for lunch, or while the engine is still running, or while I've got my solar blanket hooked on. So what I'm trying to say here is I try and keep the load as low as possible. The reason I do that is because I try to reduce as much as possible my dependency on the battery. But anyway, having said that, coming back to what I said earlier, on average, my maximum consumption is about 7 amps. And my battery that I've got is a 120 amp hour AGM battery. So 120 amp hours, and going back to what I said, 50%, that means approximately I actually only get about 60 amp hours out of that battery. Of course, if I had a lithium ion battery, then that's a different story, because I'll get the entire 100 or 120 amp hours. So with 60 amp hours, and let's get one of these. So 60 amp hours is all I've got, divided by the 7 amps that's going to be consuming right through. That means approximately I get about 8, perhaps 8.5 hours of supply. Now that's a rough calculation. Some of you who are experts, or you may be an auto sparky who's watching this, and you might argue that, and that's perfectly all right, because like I said, I am no expert, but that's my rough calculation. So I get approximately about 8 to 8.5 hours of supply at that consumption, which is 7 amps. But it always comes down, as I said, because when it's only the fridge running, it drops way down to about 4 amps per hour. So what this tells me is that I can get a healthy supply of power supplied by the auxiliary battery for at least 9 hours, and that pretty much works well for me, because in that period of time the sun comes up again, and if I'm not moving from that campsite for a couple of days or another day or whatever, I've got my solar blanket that's hooked up to the roof, and then that kicks in and the battery gets replenished. Okay, so to now try and figure out what your consumption is, what in terms of amps, as I said earlier. Okay, so to do that, you need one of these. That is a multimeter. Now this video, I'm not going to go into depth on how to use a multimeter. I'm sure most of you know what a multimeter is and you know how to use it. But if you would like to have a separate video on how to use a multimeter, leave it in the comments below. Write to me at Duncan@overlandjournals.com. Or in fact, for that matter, if you want more detailed information about this particular video and what I'm talking about, leave them in the comments or write to me at Duncan@overlandjournals.com. So in this video, it's simply, I will explain how I use this to work out my load. What you need to do is you need to identify the power source, or the line in, as I like to call it, coming in from your auxiliary battery, and you need to figure out where your line out is, or the power supply out. Now, in my case, at the back of my 4B, I've got a distribution box. It's got all the fuses, it's got all the switches to switch on the lights and so on, and where I plug in my fridge. And if you assume that is my distribution box, so I went to my distribution box, I've got the line coming in and I've got the line going out. So all I simply did was, so it's not a question of positive to negative. That would be the case if you were testing the voltage of a battery. But here we are not doing the voltage, we're doing the amperage, consumption, load. So what I then did was I hooked up one of these to the line coming in and hooked up the other end to the line going out. Now, of course, there has to be a break. So if you've got, basically, if you can just picture this in your mind, so get the line coming in and let these two complete the circuit. So if you got your line going through, it's no point sticking this to the same line or the same cable or wire. That's not going to give you much at all. So you need to break that. So take it off and then stick this in. Let your multimeter be the one that completes the circuit. So hook this onto the line that's coming in and hook this to the line that's going out, and this would be completing your circuit, and then that would give you the most accurate reading of the load in terms of amperage. So that's how I worked out my amperage. Now, there was a certain process I went through because I also wanted to know which component or which accessory consumes what. So what I first did was I switched on my fridge only. That's the 40 liter at the back, which I usually run through the night. I switched that on only, and of course I had made sure the compressor was at optimum, and I got a reading, so I know exactly what my fridge would consume at any given time. Switched that off. I switched on all my 3 floodlights. Again, I don't run all 3 floodlights at the same time, but in that worst case scenario where I'm running all three at the same time, switched it on. I got a reading as to what those lights consume. Those are LED lights and they don't really consume much. And then I switched those off and I switched on my inverter and ran my laptop and charge station where I charge my camera batteries, and I got a reading of that. So I had three separate readings. That's useful to me because I know what each and every one of those consumes if I was to switch them on. And then I switched all of them on, and then I got a reading as well. And therefore, I got a reading as to what my total load would be. So it's based on that, I arrived at the 7 amps, which I mentioned a little earlier in this video. And then based on the 7 amps, I went and got myself an appropriate battery, which was 120 amp in my case. But it's not, that's the worst case scenario as far as I am concerned, because I don't always run, as I mentioned earlier, I don't always run those lights. And because of the way we do our camp setup before sunset, and also charging of batteries and laptops, I usually do it during the day when there's solar power input as well. So there's a lot less load, or it's a lot less taxing on that auxiliary battery. So in my case, my primary objective is to keep that fridge running through the night so that my food doesn't go bad. So usually it's not even 7 amps that I'm consuming, it's a lot less than that, and approximately about 4 to 5 amps. So on my 120 amp or 60 amp hour, if you discount the 50%, and I run it at 5, I get a fair length of time I could run that battery without having any problems or disruptions in supply, so that my fridge doesn't get affected. So I hope that made sense and you found it useful. Please do give it a thumbs up. If you have questions, leave them in the comments below, or write to me at duncan@overlandjournals.com. And if you really would love to help me grow my channel, please share this video. And I'll see you again in another video in a week's time. For the moment, thank you for watching.